What an interesting array of bosses we have. We have some that test your skill, some that test you literally, and some that just test your patience with their awful design. With the much anticipated and much deserved boss nerfs that we have got recently for some of the most annoying bosses in this game, I feel now is the perfect time to make this tier list that I have wanted to make for a long time. Kicking it off with Papulatus. Honestly, once upon a time, I would have instantly put Papulatus all the way down in the E tier, but after they nerfed him and made him a lot more fair of a boss, Papulatus is quite an enjoyable fight. Granted, most of us are probably strong enough that we've forgotten what it's like to even fight Papulatus, but however, when you actually fight Pap at the early power level when he's intended to be fought, he ends up being a relatively interesting fight with interesting, unique mechanics that are both fair and well designed. I know some people may hate where you're taking segments off the clock where Papulatus will heal, but hey, I mean, it's interesting at the very least. But honestly, I feel like if you do the math right, it is very fair and it gives you more than enough time to do it. Now, I will say that the nerf to the clock bomb explosions, the big beams that come up, is a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, I think it used to create some really annoying, almost impossible to win situations. You know, where you would have the death fields on the floor that would one-shot you if you touched them, you would have clock beams rotating and about to touch, and you would have clock bombs in the exact position where you need to be if the death field wasn't there already. It was a little bit too much, it felt unfair at times. Now without the clock bombs threatening you, the fight is a little bit unengaging. Not that it's a bad thing, because it's a very early game boss, so it shouldn't be some super mechanically in-depth fight. Yet there is still some fun to be had there, and I just think Papulatus is an all-around decent above average boss, so I'm going to put him in the B tier. Next is Magnus, and talk about falling from grace, if you want to call it that. Magnus is one of the most heavily nerfed bosses since I've started playing again, and anyone who had to fight Magnus at a low power level will say it is absolutely deserved. Magnus was an obnoxious fight. It was literally just random bullshit go. Any one of his mechanics isolated really wasn't so bad, but it was just the collective barrage of nonsense that made Magnus so unappealing. And his insane life count of 15 lives really reflected that. The best strategy for Magnus was really to stay as dead for as long as possible and just wait for your burst to come back, because if you had iframes or binds, that was the safe and really only time to fight Magnus when he was at low HP. But nowadays, after almost every single mechanic of his has been nerfed in some way, Magnus is kind of an okay fight. I would actually say pretty good. Nearly every single move has some kind of counterplay now. Some of his mechanics will even prepare you for future bosses like Dark Knell and even Black Mage to an extent. I don't exactly have that much more to say about Magnus, but they took a fight that definitely would have been in the E tier for just how much nonsense it had and how little strategy you could employ, and they turned him into a B tier, and that is a really good change. Next boss is Lucid, another boss that has received some changes, nothing quite as drastic as what Magnus or Papulatus received. However, Lucid used to be a fight that had a lot of potential unfair situations. We're talking about her dragon coming down, breathing its fire breath all over the arena, and then Lucid deciding now is the time you're going to get teleported into it. Is there any counterplay? Any warning to that happening? No, and that is why it got changed. Now Lucid's teleports honestly come across as a little bit more of a mild inconvenience than anything else. You can be put into a situation where you're only clearing golems in one part of the map, and if she teleports you over into the forest of golems, you might instantly die or be in a situation where suddenly the clock is ticking. And it might honestly be controversial to say this, but I actually think that's a good mechanic. I think the golem management is pretty much the only mechanic Phase 1 has going for it, and I think it is an interesting one. Sure, it may disproportionately punish some classes like, classes that only have a single target hurricane like Bowmaster a little bit more than something like my main Dawn Warrior that basically just cleaves every single golem down without even needing to think about it. But here's the thing, that is just class advantages. That is just how things work. Michiel might be able to just absolutely destroy Phase 1 Lucid and just literally never move from its spot. Then Phase 2 starts and Michiel is suddenly one of the worst classes I have ever used for Phase 2 Lucid. It just doesn't really work with that kind of mobility. Then of course you got the butterfly mechanic. You got to manage the overabundance of butterflies and clear them with the trumpet statues, which luckily unlike a fight like Damien, those statues are always there and they don't have some janky interaction where you're holding your NPC interact key, but then for some reason it just stops, again, like Damien. However, when we move on to Phase 2, that is where my opinion of Lucid sours a tiny little bit. There aren't any mechanics that egregiously make me hate Lucid. There's nothing that I feel just wastes your time other than her movement. The idea of this boss that was once stationary and then becomes this highly mobile boss flying around all these various floating platforms is on face value an interesting idea. but Phase 2 Lucid honestly ends up just being really punishing for a shocking amount of classes in this game. So many different classes rely on various types of setup, whether it be a buff they put on the ground like Pirate Banner, or you got a class like Corsair that needs to put down a lot of summons, which are likely placed with the idea that a boss is going to be in a general area in your control at least for some amount of time, and Lucid Phase 2 just spits in the face of every class like that. Now, I don't main Corsair, I don't even play Corsair really, I'm just imagining how awful it must be for that class, because I know how awful it was for a class like Cannoneer that also has a lot of summons. They may not always be super important to your DPS, but generally you want to do as much DPS as possible, right? At least it's not all doom and gloom for those classes, because Phase 3 Lucid kicks in and all of a sudden she's back to standing still, and classes like that are once again rewarded. You just gotta make it through the frustrating experience of Phase 2 first. Now, as for Phase 3, I don't have anything extremely negative to say about it, other than the fact that when you fail it, you of course fail the entire fight, which really sucks because you just suffered through Phase 2. But the thing is, this is changing. We already know that. We don't have it yet in GMS, but we will have it in like 6 months or so. That being said, I'm putting Lucid in A rank. If it wasn't for how annoying Phase 2 was, and if and when Phase 3 gets quote-unquote fixed, I would be willing to put her in the S rank, because I think Lucid is just an all-around really mechanically well-designed fight, with some caveats that when you're in like the middle tier of power, you know, like after you're not struggling with her anymore, but you're not strong enough to just disrespect the hell out of her, she's one of the more annoying fights in the game, but that is a very situational experience. Lotus. Full disclosure, I've never done Extreme Lotus, just as I've never done quite a few of the super late game bosses, but there's a good chance 99% of you haven't either, so I don't think you'll really be sad that they're not on this list, because I'm not going to rank something that I haven't done. Lotus, on the other hand, I have fought a truly unethical amount of times on even the hard difficulty, both pre-rework and post-rework, and I gotta say, ever since Lotus's rework, I kind of hate him. But that is being a little bit vague. I do not hate the entire fight. I think Phase 1 and Phase 2 are immaculate. I think they are very well designed. They are way better than previous Lotus, but Phase 3 is where everything goes to shit. Prior to Lotus's rework, Phase 3 was kind of a nonsense RNG mess where just all kinds of debris was raining down from the sky, and it wasn't exactly the most fun thing in the world. But it turns out what came after was so much worse. I may very well be in the minority of people who feel this way, but I think Phase 3 is one of the most nonsensical disasters of a fight we have ever seen in this game. It is a visual disaster of laser beams, debris hitting you, this little wire stabbing you in the face repeatedly, all while you were supposed to be hitting Lotus with some of his own attacks to get the little meter gauge thing to lower, all while every time you get hit by it, the gauge increases. I think the whole safety mode thing is kind of interesting, but I feel like there's just way too much little nonsense going on in this fight. You see, we have a lot of chip damage fights. Phase 1 Will is an example of one, but in Phase 1 Will, you can ignore most of the mechanics, just with the caveat that if you're a class that happens to have no regen or no healing of any kind, you gotta be a little bit cautious at least and try to dodge at least the occasional thing. But when it comes to Phase 3 Lotus, some of the things are going to CC you, and I feel like with all the visual clutter of the attacks, you kind of just have to treat everything like it's going to kill you, and it's just really unfun and spammy. Even after the nerfs that it just got, it still feels annoying. But like I said earlier, Phase 1 and Phase 2 I think are perfect. Way better than Lotus's old Phase 1 and Phase 2, especially these spinning janky lasers of death. I just wish I felt that Phase 3 followed the same kind of design philosophy that Phase 1 and Phase 2 have, because otherwise it would be like an S tier fight. But I feel like Lotus Phase 3 drags the fight down so hard that I'm putting it all the way down in the C tier. Moving on to Kalos. Now, I gotta say that Kalos is the newest boss to my bossing repertoire, which means I'm going to have the least amount of experience with it. That means that I haven't had time to be annoyed with some of the mechanics it has, like bosses like Will, where I overgear it so hard that some things have just been really soured for me. Having said that, I think Kalos so far has been a relatively fun fight to experience. It has some interesting mechanics. It also does share Will-like tests, which I'm not a big fan of, but again, my damage isn't so overwhelming that it's really annoying yet. But the positive thing I do have to say about Kalos is the contraption mechanic, whatever the hell you want to call it. I don't know the official name for it. Basically, Kalos will activate various mechanics around the field for different types of attacks, and you can choose to priority disable one or just leave it going because you don't find it very threatening. That creates an interesting little dynamic where, on one hand, you may just be okay with leaving it, but if you are going to be in the fight for a long time, having one of the easy ones activated means that the two hard ones that can kill you pretty easily have that much of a higher chance to be activated, so it's got a little give and take. But so far, Kalos can sometimes feel like you're fighting Guardian Angel Slime in a way, like his attacks himself are not overwhelmingly dangerous. Some mechanics can overlap and can create dangerous situations, but for the most part, you're just waiting around, waiting for the arena to do things. But I think he does it in a lot more interesting and engaging way than what Guardian Angel Slime does. That is, however, pretty much all I have to say about Kalos, because again, this is a relatively new fight for me. I don't even think I've killed him 15 times yet, but my gut reaction is to put Kalos in S tier, which I think is going to be controversial for those people who have done him, because I honestly seem to recall a lot of people speaking quite negatively on Kalos, but maybe that's from a party experience where I'm coming from a solo experience. As for me, I just don't have anything negative to say about Kalos yet, so it's just all positive, so the S tier, that's why he's there for now. And next up is regular Hilla, not Varus Hilla. And just like with in-game progression, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this one. Hilla is an early game boss that, look, she teaches you some things. She teaches you to, hey, when there is a barrier, go stand in it, which is going to come in handy sometimes. She gives you ample text warnings, which is definitely something that you should pay attention to with almost every boss in the game, and that is a useful lesson she can teach. However, she can also teach you that reflect sucks. She also has pretty damn potent self-healing, which, you know, can be quite demoralizing when you're going in for the first time. You're a weak little baby starting out. You think you can do this boss, and all of a sudden she heals like most of her health back. The saving grace is much like the rest of Hilla, just regular Hilla's kit. She gives you warning, and I think that is good. So ultimately, I'm just going to put her down in C tier because there's nothing stellar about her, but hey, she's kind of somewhat important mechanically speaking. When the only, and I mean the only positive thing I have to say about Gloom is that it's free, that does not make it a good boss or an interesting boss. Some people may think it is, and look, I can appreciate it. Like when I first broke into Gloom for the first time, it was fun, I'm not gonna lie. Like, who doesn't like having a boss that is so easy and also so important for progression? Like, that is good in its own way. But Gloom is also incredibly boring. When you start progressing past Gloom, or even just like a couple weeks into fighting Gloom, you are probably going to be bored out of your mind fighting this boss. It is functionally immune to damage most of the time. And just like with Lucid, how I mentioned earlier, there is this really awkward growing phase where you're in like the teenage years where you're not struggling with Gloom anymore, but you're also not strong enough to just disrespect the shit out of it. So what ends up happening is that a lot of the time you're going to be in a vulnerability phase. You're going to be 10 seconds into that vulnerability phase and suddenly your burst is off cooldown, but you don't know if you're going to be strong enough to hit the next vulnerability phase. So you end up having to awkwardly set in your burst for longer than you would like, even though it is off cooldown. Suddenly your origin skill is mistimed with your burst, and that is stupid. Especially where right now in GMS, we do not have the change where you're going to have this preparation room going into bosses that are going to reset all your cooldowns. So the next boss you go into is probably going to be awkwardly timed as well, except you're just going to have to sit around and wait for it to go back to normal. But I guess I didn't even actually talk about any of Gloom's mechanics in depth. Like, the status meteors are dumb, status effects are just an unfun boss mechanic unless it has purpose, like black mages. The regular tentacles can be ignored by pretty much every class that isn't a demon class, and what else does Gloom even really have? Like, that is pretty much everything important. The darkness phase, just don't stand still, or just, you know, ignore it and just take the deaths because it's Gloom. It's not that difficult. Gloom can go in the D tier. Darknell. Now, let me tell you, I don't think there is a boss that I have had a bigger 180 on than Darknell. When I first Jesus Christ. When I first broke into Darknell, I thought this was Magnus on roids in the worst way possible. I thought everything was random, there was nothing you could do about it, and you were just going to eat death after death with little to nothing you could do about it. And honestly, sometimes that can be true. There is a lot of randomness to this fight, but I guess I also gotta mention that when I thought that about Darknell, he was pretty substantially nerfed since then. He used to actually have Gloom status meteors pretty much raining from the sky the entire fight, on top of all of his other mechanics. As well, his actual meteors, the ones that rain down diagonally, used to slide along the floor for an unnatural amount of time, essentially denying large areas of the arena for an obnoxious amount of time, and losing those two mechanics actually made Darknell so much more manageable and more fun. You see, unlike a lot of other bosses that surround Darknell, Darknell doesn't really have set in stone mechanics that you need to adhere strictly to. It is all reactionary. You need to control Darknell, manipulate manipulate his movement and put yourself in advantageous positions, and I find that makes Darknell an incredibly satisfying fight. And the only thing stopping me from putting Darknell in S tier are those situations that can still feel unfair. Even with so much experience under my belt, there are still times where I die to Darknell where I feel like, yeah, like I could have used my iframe, but too much happened too quickly and I couldn't react quick enough. But I know the fight well enough that I can take the odd death or two from that and it's not a big deal. Regardless, any fight where some of your deaths can feel like you really could have done nothing, especially on some classes, I think that makes them lose some points. So I'm going to put Darknell in the A tier. Now on to Damien, and talk about improvement. Now, I'm not going to say that Damien is a perfect boss. I would definitely even still say that Damien is probably pretty high on the should be reworked list, but Damien is no longer nearly as frustrating as he used to be. He's still a painfully easy boss, and he is still quite elusive, but not nearly as bad as he used to be, particularly with Phase 2, since his balls are smaller, fewer in number, slower, and they disappear when you bind him, just like real life. Just the changes to his Phase 2 balls make him already so much more manageable and less frustrating to fight. Now you can talk about other changes, like he's able to be up in the air for less time than he used to be, and honestly that's all Damien really needed to be a lot better, because Phase 2 is where most of the frustration was. That being said, at the end of the day, Damien is still an elusive boss. He just no longer is cripplingly punishing to classes that need to set up or slowly ramp their damage, but he's still easy, which can make him a somewhat boring fight, especially if you're going to be in there for a long time. And you know, he's just not the most fun boss in the world, but because he's improved so much, I'm gonna put him in the B tier, which is probably still pretty generous, but given that he would have been like the bottom of E tier probably, you know, that's kind of a win. Next up is Cygnus. There's not exactly a lot to talk about here. Cygnus is a lot of mechanics that just aren't really relevant in today's landscape of MapleStory. So many of the mechanics can just be completely ignored, and a lot of it just ends up being more confusing than anything. Not confusing in the sense of like going into will without knowing the tests. Confusing as like, why do I need to dodge or care about any of this? And the answer usually often ends up being, you don't. So you normally only have to care about things like her map wiper. That's pretty much it. And for the most part, you're not going to be in this fight long enough to ever bother learning any real mechanics anyway. It's not a particularly bad boss fight, but it's also not really that interesting. So she's kind of below average, so she's going to go in the C tier with Hilla. Next on the list is Crimson Queen, and she is evidence that not all early game bosses are made equal, because I think Crimson Queen is a fantastic boss fight. The only negative I really have to say about the Crimson Queen boss fight is that the dot effect that you get inflicted with is just kind of weird. It's just this potion tax, and it gets cleansed by being breathed on. It really comes across as nothing but a do you have an autopotter check, and it's just kind of stupid. But the rest of the fight are exceptional mechanics in my opinion. Crimson Queen has varied phases, all which are very clearly telegraphed at what they are going to do. They'll have clear counterplay, and that makes her a fun boss fight to learn. Out of all of the Chaos Root Abyss bosses, I think Crimson Queen is probably the best designed one. She also gets a little bonus points in my books for being one of the first bosses to really encourage you to use your hero's will. When it comes to the seduction phase, you know that if you get seduced into her and die, well, you didn't kill the mirror fast enough. And Crimson Queen has really the only reflect that has never made me annoyed or angry. Damage reflect is generally a very lazy and unwelcome mechanic. Crimson Queen's is pretty inoffensive. I don't think it enhances the fight at all, but because it's so well telegraphed and you have forewarning about it, I really don't think it's that bad, even though, again, reflect sucks, and hers, well, at least it's very visually obvious when it's active. The bottom line is most of her mechanics are pretty well telegraphed, very engaging, and also, most importantly, none of them are annoying or take away from the fight, even the reflect. So even though it might confuse some people, I'm putting her in S tier. Next is Black Mage. There is so much to say about Black Mage, and given that it's a 4-phase fight, there is a lot to potentially talk about. So let me just get the bad out of the way first, because like Crimson Queen, I don't have a lot of bad to say about Black Mage. Phase 1 Black Mage was clearly designed for a party. As such, being a pure solo player, I do not have the experience to talk about Phase 1, so simply put, I won't. I'm sure it is probably engaging when played properly in a group, but as a solo player, when something goes wrong and you don't immobilize neutralize the statues or kill them in time, it's hell. So let's just instead talk about the rest of the fight. I think phase 2 is probably the most fun and enjoyable phase of Black Mage. The randomness of phase 2 can be quite punishing at times and put you in some situations where it feels like you are almost guaranteed to die, but outside of those somewhat random and kind of rare experiences, phase 2 is very enjoyable, just like most of the rest of Black Mage. But when you get past phase 2, phase 3 is easily one of the most challenging things I have ever personally done in MapleStory. I'll admit that it's not always the most fun kind of challenge because so many things can go wrong so quickly. You get an unlucky laser pattern, you accidentally take a kick to the face, and suddenly you've lost 1 to 3 lives in the blink of an eye. But you do have so many lives in the Black Mage fight that if phase 3 is really your only problem area, you're probably going to be fine as long as you have enough damage. And it really depends on what class you are. Some classes really excel at different phases of Black Mage. It is one of the most varied fights in the game, and different phases will reward different classes with different mechanics. For example, it's one of the better fights for Dark Sight classes as well as Lifesteal classes. Both of those kind of class mechanics have exceptional advantages in the Black Mage fight, as well as anyone that has some kind of glide or way to stall mid-air aside from just blink. I mean, look, Black Mage at one point was the ultimate fight in MapleStory. It was the big bad guy that the game was building up to for years, and to convey that, they gave him 4 phases, a very long boss fight, and a ton of different mechanics, some of which you have to worry about the entire time. The most important of which, ignoring classes like Paladin's percent HP damage reduction, it does not care. The only class that's really going to get away with treating Black Mage like just about anyone else is Mahil. I think you would be really hard pressed to find somebody who genuinely hates the Black Mage fight aside from frustration they might be experiencing trying to fight him. But that's also what can make him good. He is a tough fight to learn, especially if you try to do it solo like I did, and ultimately it'll be very satisfying when you finally overcome him. And since he's a monthly boss, you're not exactly going to get a ton of practice against Black Mage on the regular, you know, unless you're going out of your way to do it in practice mode or maybe throwing a legion of alts at it. But other than that, you're going to have to continuously respect this boss because it is so easy to lose a lot of lives really quickly if you do not adhere to the mechanics properly, which is a very long and convoluted and kind of unstructured way of saying I think Black Mage is S tier. Moving on to Akechi, who, without any kind of suspense or build-up, is going right down in the E tier. This is a boss that has a soft reflect. It won't exactly kill you like most damage reflects do, but it will waste your time like a damage immunity. He binds you and you bind him. This boss is just kind of annoying at every turn, and the mechanics that he does have just aren't interesting enough to make him really matter at all. You just kind of show up, get your money, maybe get a boss elixir, and maybe an MVP experience ticket, and call it a day. You check in and get your Akechi rewards, and you try not to think about him again. Next up is the OG, the original, Zakum. Honestly, really good early game boss fight. It does have damage immunity, which can be just an outright annoying mechanic, especially because of how long Zakums last, but outside of that one annoying mechanic, Zakum is a really solid boss fight. Really engaging mechanics, clearly telegraphed, all pretty damn fair, and just all around fun for an early game progression. Now, I'm actually very surprised that they have never made an extreme Zakum. Not only would it just be iconic in terms of MapleStory, because Zakum again is the original boss, but its mechanics are honestly pretty fitting for a mid to like early end game boss if they buffed its stats up enough. They might have to add on a few more attacks, but with the current state of progression, most players blast past Zakum without ever really having to learn the mechanics. But for the most part, it is all pretty intuitive. You see hands being slammed down, stand in the safe spots where hands aren't. The floor lights on fire, go on the platforms that just spawned. I really would love to give Zakum an S tier, and I think it is so close to deserving one, but the immunity phase, if you don't kill Enraged Zakum quick enough or blast through the phases quick enough, just drags things down so much. I mean, like, padding the fights always sucks. Like, if you want to make a boss fight last longer, just give it more health. Don't stop us from attacking it in an arbitrary way, like making us do 1 damage. Thankfully, that is a mostly outdated mechanic, but Zakum is one of the bosses where it's still present. Despite that, I'm still putting Zakum in A tier because other than that, really good early game boss fight. Next is Will, another one of the bosses that thankfully for us, it has been the recipient of some kind of substantial nerfs, nothing too serious, just things that make Will respect our time a little bit more, which is good because Will is one disrespectful motherfucker in that regard. He was a lot worse, but he is still kind of bad, and that is ultimately what's going to drag Will down some points. But let's talk about the fight just as a whole. Will is literally and figuratively going to be one of your first big tests in boss progression. He is the first boss that has mechanics that if you do not adhere to them properly, you literally will not and cannot progress. And unfortunately for us, those mechanics are time gated in a way. They don't activate at certain times like they used to a very long time ago, but they are going to eat up a certain amount of time no matter what, because the tests just need time to take place. And that right there is the crux of the downsides of the Will fight. The longer you fight Will, as in the more weeks under your belt you have fighting this boss, the more Will start to suck. At a certain point where you have enough damage and you have enough experience with this boss, the mechanics themselves will no longer be that threatening, and you will see your 10 lives as more of a resource to help you just end this monotonous fight quicker. Now I really wish I could enjoy Will more. You see, a fight like Darknell continues to be engaging no matter how many times I fight it. I can disrespect the hell out of Darknell, but I still have fun in that boss fight, and most importantly, Darknell isn't wasting my time. You see, the more that you know the Darknell fight, the better you can be at damaging Darknell through some of his more dangerous patterns, and in doing so you're speeding up the boss considerably. Unlike Will, there really isn't much room to improve the speed of the boss fight, because Will across all 3 phases is kind of stationary. So most of the time you will be able to do consistently good damage to Will, and the better you know the fight, the faster you feel the fight should be, but it just ends up being slowed down by all the arbitrary waiting times for tests to complete, for tests to start, for Will to become damageable after he actually completed the test. If it wasn't for all those arbitrary wait times, Will honestly would be an S tier fight, because I think the mechanics are engaging. It's just so many ways for him to waste your time. It's annoying, it's obnoxious, and the more geared you are and the better you know this fight, you're pretty much doomed to only hate it more and more as you do it. That being said, I'm still putting him in B tier. He would be a lot lower if it wasn't for the recent changes that at least sped the tests up a little bit, but he still deserves to be at least somewhat high. Next is Von Bon. This magical little murder chicken probably has the most simplistic kit out of all the Chaos Root Abyss roster, yet even with that simplistic kit, Von Bon still manages to be a threatening boss that demands consistent respect. He has very clear mechanics that will one-shot you if you're not careful, but there's very obvious counterplay to it. I also happen to personally enjoy when bosses include ducking and jumping as counter options to their attacks. It's simple, and it's something that literally every class has access to. Some can do it better than others, but again, we can all do it, so it's nice to have a boss that doesn't overly favor one type of class more than others. And even though the time mechanic of the Von Bon fight, which is probably supposed to be the focus and most interesting mechanic, it usually ends up being forgotten these days because the level of damage that we have now, yeah, Von Bon just doesn't usually live too long. It just ends up being a simple fight with only a few attacks that you need to worry about. But even despite that, I think it still is a very solid boss. Oh, but I guess I will say that the phase, or rather attack, where Von Bon disappears and it go into the other realm to kill his little clone thing, kind of stupid, kind of wastes your time. Probably the point to put some time pressure on with the time mechanic that, again, doesn't really matter, but you know, it's a small thing, honestly. Murder Chicken is going in the A tier, and I honestly think he well deserves that spot. On to Varishilla. Now I think you're going to get a lot of different opinions about Varishilla depending on who you ask. I would have to imagine that there are some out there who do not like this fight because they've only done it from a party play experience where everybody has healing familiars and you just hug the corner and beat the crap out of her. Certainly not the most fun experience in the world, but it is a way you can approach her, at least in GMS. But if you're going to play from a solo perspective, even with healing familiars, you're going to have to respect Varishilla's mechanics. And one thing I appreciate about this boss is she doesn't disappear that often. She can teleport, and as some classes that might make you miss some things, but for the most part, she is always available to attack, and the better you are at dodging the various threads and other attacks she has, the better your uptime is going to be. Most importantly, I think what illustrates how well designed Varishilla is, I think when you first go into her, even with healing familiars, she ends up being one of the hardest bosses you can possibly learn. But by the end, when you know her mechanics really well, she can also end up being one of the easiest. And it's not exactly like you're cheesing her or anything, you just know the safe spots. You know where to stand, where you can DPS relatively safely and not get threaded up like crazy. You understand her attack animations, which ones you have to run from, how you dodge the different ones. It's just incredibly satisfying. And even though you do technically cheese her with healing familiars, it just changes the way you play. When you play with familiars, ideally you would never ever get a stack of thread. Whereas instead, if you decide to fight her the pure intended way, she is a little bit more of an elusive boss where you do need to back off more often in order to thread yourself up. Personally, I have fought her both ways. I really only do the no familiar way when I'm either feeling really lazy and don't want to change to healing familiars, or I feel like just giving myself an extra challenge, which is really not that often. I find both ways are respectively challenging in their own ways, but obviously fighting her without the familiar cheese is going to be way harder than the other way around. And if I were to try to force one negative thing to say about the Varicilla fight, it would just be how it's fought in parties. I don't like that the stacking mechanic is a group effort. Now, it's perfectly fine when you're in a coordinated party where people will clear their stacks and everybody's friends or at least acquaintances, but in public parties, things can get a little bit vicious and dog-eat-dog, and people will just let you die because, well, that increases their chances of loot. But I do think that is at least somewhat uncommon and really not that big a deal. So I'm putting her up in the S tier where I think she firmly belongs. Vellum. You know, for another famously elusive boss, I actually respect Vellum, because you know why? When you first walk into the Vellum fight for the first time and you see that 20-minute timer, you know that it's probably not going to be that bad. Compared to other elusive or time-wasting bosses like Gloom and Damien and Will, when they're wasting your time, they also aren't really threatening your life. There are no mechanics to dodge or really pay attention to, but Vellum, on the other hand, often when you can't damage him, it's because he's too busy trying to murder your ass with his stabbing little tails. But Vellum makes up for that by having attacks that can be threatening, but also are large windows for you to damage him freely. Attacks like the green lightning spam or the fire breath or laser breath that he does at either side of the map. Both of those attacks have large vulnerability windows where as long as you're playing well, you're not going to die. Oh, I guess I forgot the triple fireball too. That also leaves Vellum unburrowed for a long time, attacking in one direction, where as long as you're dodging the tails that are continuing to try to stab you, you're going to have a large window to DPS him. I believe Vellum to be the shining example of how to do this elusive style of boss right. His health is not overwhelming, his timer reflects that, and for every attack or pattern that makes him hard to hit, he has one that makes him easy to hit as well. He's also one of the first bosses that is going to teach you patience, because Vellum has a lot of attacks, particularly the tails and the stun stones, which are going to get you killed by tails, will constantly punish you if you are too greedy. You need to be patient for Vellum, be patient for his openings because he has so many. Now, I feel like I do need to mention Ride or Die because Vellum has been in both of them so far, and whenever Vellum shows up, he's one of the worst. Like, if I were to make a list of every single boss I do not want to see in Ride or Die, Vellum would be probably at the top, if not pretty damn well near the top. I think his fight is already masterfully designed for exactly how it is. The last thing Vellum needs is 20 additional mechanics at random. But since Ride or Die is just an event, I think Vellum absolutely deserves the S tier. Next is Guardian Angel Slime, and man, I want to love this boss, but why did they have to give it so much health, damage reduction, and the ability to heal over time? None of its mechanics are particularly annoying. It is almost always able to be attacked except for when the Guardian Angel wave is happening, and yet still somehow it manages to feel just as bad, if not worse, than pretty much every other time-wasting boss I've mentioned. It also doesn't help that right now we do have the 2-minute class changes, so we're all 2-minute burst classes, and Guardian Angel waves are still set for 3-minute classes. So right now, at least for the time being, Guardian Angel Slime feels even worse than it should. Its mechanics aren't the most engaging thing in the world. Yeah, you gotta block the portal with 3 slimes and then match the color. I would wager to say that Guardian Angel Slime is probably, if not one of the easiest bosses to learn in the entire game, at least ones that actually warrant you to learn their mechanics. But no matter how much you learn it and master this fight for what little there is to master, it will still end up being one of the longest boss fights on your weekly rotations. And even though manipulating the slime's movements between the platforms to make it easier to safely DPS them can be kind of interesting, ultimately it's not enough to save this otherwise really boring fight. So for that, I am putting it down in the D tier with the very similarly boring fight, Gloom. Saren fucks my shit up on the regular. I even think that I have a passable understanding of the Saren fight, at least every phase except Dawn. When Dawn phase rolls around, my lives become a resource. Luckily, I know most of the Saren fight well enough that I can often make it to Dawn with 5 lives pretty easily, unless I'm being careless, which is pretty common. Now, it seems that no matter how many times I actually do the Dawn phase, I never really understand the grasp of it or get any better at it. I'm in pure survival mode the entire time. I will use literally any tool in my arsenal to just get by that phase as painlessly as possible. I don't particularly like the design of it. I've seen other players handle it pretty damn well, or what I would call even masterfully, but that is not me. Whether it's personal kryptonite or not, I don't know. What I do know is I hate it. And what's sad is I actually love the rest of the Saren fight, with the exception of one single mechanic. The light beams that raise up from the floor in phase 1, I feel those go off way too quickly. I mean, it's not even really a feeling. It is just factual that those things are so goddamn quick that unless you have an instant animation canceling mobility tool, you are probably going to get hit by it if it spawns underneath you. But I do actually think I recall that in some patch notes at some point in the future for KMS that we will be getting, I think they actually do delay them a little bit or slow them down. I don't know how much, or if that actually, if I'm just imagining things and wishful thinking, but I hope that they do, because that mechanic is nonsense. It's not particularly threatening and is not going to kill you outright, but it can contribute to your death by filling up your light gauge. But everything else in phase 1 and even every other phase 2 phase except Dawn, I think is very well designed. Everything is very easily dodgeable, telegraphed, and feels fair. So far of the bosses that I've actually done myself, Saren was by far the hardest to do, even harder than Black Mage. Black Mage may be a longer fight, but it's a little bit more of a marathon where you're not always fighting for your life, whereas Saren, all it takes is a moment of being careless and you can lose a life quite easily. The entirety of the fight is just not being too greedy, because she has a lot of things that will punish even a fraction of a second of greed. Overall, I think she is a phenomenal fight. She is a ridiculous challenge. She is rewarding in the Mitra's emblem. Everyone loves a pitched item that can't blow up, and I think she deserves the A tier. She would be an S if not for the ridiculous light beams in phase 1. Maybe that future KMS patch that I might be imagining will change that for the better, but I think Dawn phase is always going to suck. It always feels one mechanic too bloated. I think if you could remove any one of the mechanics, it would be a lot better, but other than that, I kind of just treat it like Black Mage phase 1, something that feels really unfair for one solo player, and I just need to either power through a DPS or wait it out until it rolls back to the beginning of phase 2. I'm going to be honest, I don't actually know what any of Princess No's new mechanics do, and at this point, there's no point in learning, because we might be getting the rework that Maple C got, or whatever JMS, presumably it came from JMS. We don't have it yet, but we will. But right now, Princess No sucks. I don't think there's any like reflect-like mechanics or 1-1s or damage immunity that makes her obnoxious, but she literally has nothing interesting about her fight, so I'm putting her down in the E tier. She's not annoying, she's just completely uninteresting. Pink Bean is pretty much the last representation of the classic MapleStory boss design as far as weekly bosses go. And let me tell you, that is not a good thing or a compliment. One of the weakest parts of classic MapleStory was the boss design. It was nothing but 1-1, status effects, damage reflection, damage immunity, seductions, and one-hit body kills. Pink Bean may not represent all of that, but what Pink Bean does have in troves is damage reflect, whether it be from the statues or Pink Bean itself. The damage reflect and the constant barrage of status effects are really the only mechanics that are ever going to do anything to you in this entire miserable fight. It's a relic of the past that really should just stay in the past, and while it is cool that we have this basically time capsule of a boss, it's one of the worst offenders when it comes to damage reflect, which in my opinion is the worst bossing mechanic MapleStory has ever put out. Damage immunity, yeah, it wastes your time and it's annoying, but damage reflection, it's so stupid. Pink Bean can go right down into the E tier. I would wager to say that I don't hate Pierre as much as many people do. While his mechanics are definitely not designed for a solo player, it is unfortunately how pretty much 99% of players are only ever going to fight Pierre in a solo party. And when Pierre inevitably splits on your very first kill ever, you're going to be very confused and probably lost and wondering why you can't do the fight properly. Whereas now we have to create new proper ways to fight Pierre. You can either wait for him to go down to the lowest possible amount of health before he splits, which is roughly a little over 30%, wait to get an opposite hat and burst till your heart's content and hope that it's enough damage, or you can simply die and resurrect after Pierre has already split and then resurrect with no hat, letting you damage both equally, but you don't get the extra damage bonus, which a new player breaking into Pierre for the first time will very likely need. Now this all sounds very negative, but despite that, I actually do enjoy the Pierre fight. I just also acknowledge that it has a lot of flaws that aren't really suitable for the modern MapleStory soloing landscape. That being said, I like that we were able to make alternatives. It is not so overwhelmingly unfair like Black Mage Phase 1. It might feel that way at first, but once you hear people tell you the solutions, it is a little satisfying to fight Pierre in that new way. I would say that the only major downside of the Pierre fight with these new strategies in mind is just waiting for the opposite hats to come around, because it's completely random, and sometimes Pierre just ends up wasting a ton of your time as he constantly switches you to the same hat as himself over and over and over. It is a little obnoxious. I think the fight could be improved drastically by adding some kind of like Damien-like altar on the map that is always there and allows you to switch the hat at a moment's notice at your control. So ultimately, I'm going to give Pierre a C rank, which I'm willing to bet most people are going to think is way too generous. And that's all that I am personally capable of ranking, because I have never done Limbo, Baldrix, or Kaling. Maybe someday, but that's going to take me a long time to get there. As a solo player, things go pretty slowly, and I'm also pretty damn lazy.